good afternoon to all the lovely participants that have joined this webinar. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for the day, namely Dr. Benita Moolman. She is a senior lecturer and program manager at the Global Citizenship Programme at the University of Cape Town. She holds a DPhil in Feminist Geography from the University of California, Davis, also known as UCDavis, and a MPhil in Human and Gender Studies from the University of the Western Cape. Benita has worked at the Human Sciences Research Council and at Rape Crisis in Cape Town. She currently teaches on social justice, decoloniality, citizenship, and critical community engaged research methodologies. Benita has researched and published on gender-based violence, masculinities, intersectional identities, and feminist methodologies. Benita is interested in decolonial and feminist pedagogies, as well as thinking through African epistemologies and situated knowledge making. Her most recent publication is a co-edited collection with Nadia Sanger entitled Racism, Violence, Betrayals, and New Imaginaries, Feminist Voices 2022, University of KwaZulu-Natal Press. So without further ado, Benita, over to you.
Thank you, Widad. Thanks, Widad. It's always strange hearing somebody read like a bio about oneself. But thanks so much, Widad, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, both from your team, Widad, Cheryl, Janet. Yeah, we're colleagues. We're in the same office. We're on the same floor. Not that we've seen each other for a long time because of COVID and remote working. But happy to be here. And please, for me, my approach to this kind of thing is always that I'm in conversation with people and everybody who's present, rather than something like, you know, this is sort of rigid information or knowledge that's being shared. It's always in conversation. It's always being constructed and deconstructed and co-created and all those things. So, so please, in terms of the way the session will be shaped, it's going to be through a conversation. So please, at any point, if you have any questions or comments, leave it in the chat or let me know as we do this presentation today. Let me see if I can share the screen. Okay, so everybody can see that. Let me just. Excellent. So the title, everybody can see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the title of the presentation is Student Engagement at the Nexus of Learning, Education and Justice, with a focus on visibility and voice. And you'll see through the presentation why I suppose I'm grappling with voice and visibility and what that means in the online space, but also, of course, face-to-face, blended learning or hybrid options. What does visibility and voice mean, particularly around difference, particularly around inclusion or diversity, if that's the language that you use? What do that mean for student participation and student engagement? So just some of the guiding questions for me as I speak through the presentation. I'm interested in this sort of concept of learning spaces, and we always talk about the classroom. Now we speak about online, but how do we establish and cultivate learning spaces and learning cultures that engages students? How do we draw on knowledge, context, being, practice, and power? And again, these are concepts that I'm going to come back to throughout the presentation. Not so much knowledge today, because the focus today is around student engagement rather than on knowledge transmission or on the idea of multiple knowledges or decolonial language of pluriversal knowledges, right? So the idea of plenty or many and multiple. The focus today is going to be more on issues of context, being, and power, and kind of thinking through practice. If they are, I think it's called instructional designers, that's what I think some of my colleagues are called in SILT. You know, so it's not only about whether you're a lecturer in a classroom, it's also just about design and thinking through design through the lens of being, practice, and power. So you'll see as we go along, those are some of the concepts that I begin to interrogate. questions around what are social justice pedagogies that we draw on, and there's so many, and people draw from different pedagogies, and so it's about how to identify that for ourselves and how do we bring it into our, as I say, both design and teaching practice. What are our assumptions and principles, and in the context of decolonization, what is social justice? So for me, it's important to think about student engagement through the lens of social engagement. And social engagement as a process and a relation that's activated through teaching, both in course design and in teaching practice. And student engagement is not just about students' participation. I think often there's the assumption that when students participate that they're engaging, or if they are present, not present, but present, that they are engaging. And we find, I think, just with sort of lecturers that begin, or even clinical educators, people that begin to teach, to begin to think about what does it mean for students to engage with the content? What does it mean for them to engage with their peers? If you have a classroom of 250, how do they engage with their peers? How do they engage with content? What does that engagement mean for us as teachers in our roles as teachers and lecturers? And then how does learning cultures enable student engagement, or disable or constrain student engagement? So student engagement is broader than only the content and broader than only the relationship between teacher and lecturer. And who are the students that we are having to engage? So just to think about, I think often there's the sort of idea, and maybe not consciously, I think maybe so more subconsciously and maybe more historically, that students are empty vessels, right? And who's the knower? As lecturers, we have to transmit and share knowledge that we find in books, right? So this idea of the disembodied, unknowing student. But we know that that's not the case. We know that we've moved far from that. It's not part of the way we think about who we teach, and and it's not sort of the way that we think about who shows up and who turns up in terms of our learning spaces. I think particularly during this COVID period, there was a big emphasis on pedagogies of care, pedagogies of empathy, humanizing pedagogies. I think people often refer to those sort of pedagogies as a way of recognizing students as embodied and teaching as contextual. And so I was just thinking for myself, I was trying to think who are the students that have attended and participated in the courses that I've taught. And I think of in January 2021, we had to teach us a course, and there were so many students that were actually located in Lesotho. And so for me, a big question on the 4th of January 2021 was, so who is the Lesotho student that I'm trying to engage in a course on, for example, social infrastructures? Who's the Bloemfontein student who's sitting in an informal settlement trying to connect to Wi-Fi on the 4th of January, right? So who are those students? How do I engage those students in the course content? Who is the Pan-African student? Who's the student dealing with mental health? Who is the student that identifies as LGBTIQ+, right? So our students are human, yes, but they come from very, very different and diverse contexts. And so how do we begin to engage with those contexts? And so I asked myself, what do I know about who these students are, right? What is idea of being? And when I introduced the presentation, I said I'm going to speak to being, practice, power, context. So who's this being in my classroom? And what are the contexts that they come from? And through which they show up, right? Because you show up through the context. And so, for example, I'm thinking of the Lesotho students had to find ways to make sure that Vodacom, Lesotho was paid from Vodacom, South Africa, or from UCT. So lots of things for the student before they could actually even step into the classroom, before they could actually connect online. And so there's lots happening for students outside of our classrooms, outside of the learning spaces. And how does this influence and shape who they are and how they show up? And how does that determine and shape the teaching context, the practice, and the power? So it's admitting that I know very little about the context, right? I know very little about Lesotho. I've never been there. I know very little about Bloemfontein and informal settlements in Bloemfontein. Yes, I have some knowledge of informal settlements in Cape Town, but still very little. I know very little about identifying outside of categories of heterosexuality. Very little about mental health, for example. So admitting that I don't know much. So how do I begin to engage and not only learn from them, but how do we establish a relationship, right? How do I employ teaching as a socially engaged process through which I establish this learning space and learning culture where any of the students can show up in the classroom? And so I always just appreciate this statement that says, if you attend to the needs of the most marginalized, then everybody benefits, right? So it's thinking through students who are, of course, outside of Cape Town, of course, don't have access to data, of course, don't have access to laptops and technology, or a meal every day, or a home, or a place to call home, etc., etc. So how do I employ teaching as a socially engaged process so that I begin to establish that relationship with students, so that students can show up in the classroom? So the questions for me is, how do we create a showing up, a presence in the classroom? How do we enable visibility and voice? So visibility, and of course this is very, I'm keeping it sort of, not making it too complex at this point, right? Because it's about, I think, just understanding some of these concepts. Visibility about recognition, just taking it literally, right? So who do we see? What enables me to see who's in the classroom, who's showing up? It's about both recognition and representation. And I think we speak often about representation, maybe less so about recognition and how to recognize and knowing that what we can't see. So for example, I'm just thinking of some of the online tools, such as WhoClap, right, that we use it. And we use it, when I say we, I'm talking about GC, we use it often, but how does that enable visibility of students? So who can we see through using WhoClap? So we can possibly hear people, right, because that's the design of a lot of some of the sort of tools within WhoClap. But how do we hear? So how do we both see and hear through the tools that we use? And it's just one example. Of course, there's many. How do we hear voice? Not only who is speaking, because that's often about representation, but how do we hear what is being said? What does that mean for agency and power? And again, if I think of design, what tools do we use to enable speaking within our spaces, our learning spaces, and our classrooms? So thinking through how we use our online tools to enable this, and I'm partly just speaking about this because I know there's a few instructional designers in the space today. So thinking through design, and thinking through some of these concepts as we design, and in terms of using those tools and what the tools can do, and who it includes in that way, right, and who it excludes. So I'm going to end here for now, or pause here, and I'm going to ask, we're going to move into small groups, breakaway rooms, and we're going to work for about 10 minutes, within, 10, 15 minutes until 12:30 in those small groups, and to think through the questions or discuss these questions. How have you enabled and affirmed visibility, voice, and presence in the classroom through both course design and teaching practice? And then as designers and teachers, what is it that you can see? What is it that you can't see? And what is the social justice lens that you draw on to enable you to see and to hear? So I spoke about social engagement. A little bit later, I'll talk about decoloniality. But for you, what is it that you draw on? And what is it that you can see and what is it that you can hear? Yeah, that's the next slide. Everybody back. Okay, great, thank you. So let's have some feedback from the groups. I can't see anybody's hand, Max, so if you can, I'm not sure if I can see.
I don't see any hands yet, but I'll let you know if I see.
Yeah, so just some feedback around what you discussed in your groups. Did you manage to get to all 3 questions? My guess is no, but if you have, that's great. And if you got to the first one as well only, that's also fine. Okay. Yakuluntu, I can see your hand.
Yep.
Thank you. So I was in group 4, and with question 1, what we shared with the question that was saying, how have you enabled and affirmed visibility, voice, presence in the classroom through course design and teaching practice? What was shared by Diane, which was quite interesting, is she said that she would, it was in the way in which she would pose the questions, for example, during teaching, you know, how she asks the students on their, to draw on their own personal experiences in relation to the context. Also, the second point was also how, you know, how she decides she would give the students the liberty to decide how they want to present, for example, an assessment, which relates to UDL, multiple means of engagement. Also within question 1, we also found that, for example, Padlets, having introductory sessions for the students where, for example, within the Padlet boards, everyone shares their background, something interesting about you. In that way, it affirmed visibility, your voice, and the presence even within the virtual space. We also found that even within breakout rooms, you know, you're able to sort of share more intimate, I mean, for those who are introverts, you're able to share yourself more freely, and your voice comes out within breakout rooms, or even just having smaller group sessions and tutorials. Let me see if I've left anything else. Yeah, I think that's what we shared with the first one, but I'll leave the others, colleagues, to also, I don't want to steal all the answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that group. You didn't get to the third question.
Hi, sorry, I'll jump in a little bit. I think for the second and the third, we kind of just talked a little bit because we were running out of time, but one of the things that was done in a course that I taught was bringing in the aspect of allowing students to code switch in their responses in the lab sessions where they were doing smaller tasks. These were the continuous assessment tasks. They were allowed to respond in their own home languages, as well as with English, or so either or both. And the feedback during evaluations was really good on that, just allowing students to express themselves in the way that they understood whatever it is that we were teaching them. So for example, if we were talking about discourse, which was quite a difficult concept for quite a few students to understand, some of them were explaining it using examples, experiential examples. So stuff that they've gone through in their own in their own lives, and bringing that into the explanation of what discourse is.
Great, thanks for those examples. Great examples. One of the other groups, the next group, some feedback. Judith Mackenzie.
Hi, just sharing from group 6, and we had a few additional things about design, and we looked at something like timetabling of lectures can work for certain people or not, and the example was given by Kristen, of having lectures at 4, 6, and then it's a good time for part-time, and that includes those people who might be working. And then also our group spoke about like online space can be used sometimes when people feel marginalized and don't feel confident to be in the highly visible, but they want to share. Then there are also those things of like forum discussions, and not necessarily having to like show your face, but to share what you want to say at the same time. So that was some of the things on that. And then I thought what was interesting is what it is that you see and what you don't see. And the responses there is that you see the student outputs and assessments, but we might only see when they're coping, but you don't really see so much when they're not coping, and you don't see why they're not coping, and you don't know what is going on in their lives. And then in terms of the social justice, we talked about critical pedagogy as being important and emancipatory approaches. And then we also talked about the need for inclusive practices and inclusion being really important. So that's group 6, but Kristen, Benedict, and Nophobo, Anthea, please to add whatever they would like to that.
Thanks, Judith. Great. Thanks again for asking some questions and some things for us to think about. Yeah. Anybody else from that group want to add? I see Richard, your hand is up. Please go for it.
Sorry, I was having trouble gaining control of my mouse. I'm not from group 6, so before I speak, I'm representing group 2. If someone else from group 6 wants to speak.
No, that's okay, Richard. Go ahead, because we're going to be out of time, so I'm happy to continue. Thank you.
From group 2, in response to the first question, 3 areas. One would be starting off with a questionnaire right at the beginning before the course starts, finding out where students are coming from and who they are. Secondly, important to create a safe space, as a space where students who are marginalized can feel safe speaking about how they are. And ironically, that may also mean enabling anonymous contributions. So using discussion tools that may be something like Padlets or Jamboard, where students can contribute anonymously. And one of the possibilities is using controversial or confrontational examples that are designed to provoke a wide variety of affective responses, so that people with many different perspectives can share their perspectives. But one of the conditions there is making sure that they feel safe enough to do so. And that tied in, we felt, to what we can and what we can't see, because we can't always see whether or not a student feels safe. We can't always see what their situation is. And then finally, the social justice lens. We had a couple of authors mentioned, Nancy Fraser being one, Paulo Freire, around understanding context and a journey being another. And also understanding one's own position, positionality, and experience is very important. So how may you have experienced being marginalized and being able to empathize and apply that to other situations? And unfortunately, Alea didn't actually get a chance to speak in that part of the discussion. So I'd like to open it up to her to add anything that she would like to.
Thanks, Richard. I think it was very well captured. I don't think I have anything else to add, actually.
Thanks then. Thanks for Richard and Alea, both of you, and thanks for sharing again your experience and your knowledge in terms of what you draw from and with the group. Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, ideas of safety and brave spaces, that's a whole different conversation around how do you sort of cultivate that, how do you nurture that through, I suppose, relational design and practice. But thanks for raising that as well. I think we have one more group to feedback. Is it 1 or 2? Yeah. If you can have the next group, because we need to close off this exercise. Okay, great. Lara, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I'll just go briefly. I was in a group with Mashudu and Kofi. So we discussed a few things. We mainly focused on the first 2 questions. Just not to repeat what others have said, but we were thinking about a comparison between the online space and the in-person space, and what you can see and what you can't see, and reflected on the fact that I think a lot of lecturers struggle with the online space, feeling that they can't see what students are up to, if students are getting left behind and that kind of thing, which I think could be true even in the in-person space. If you have a class of 500 students, you're not going to be able to tell just by them, even being present or sitting in the lecture, that they're actually not struggling or getting left behind. So I think, and a lot of students, even if they don't actively participate, are still absorbing the knowledge and are still reflecting. And I think that shows quite clearly in the assignments. So yeah, it was just something interesting to reflect on, and we were trying to think of ways that we can, particularly in the online space, design for that engagement and opportunities for that engagement that are comfortable for everyone. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mean, that's the point of...
Yes,
just
to add a little, we also discussed the use of universal design for learning, and saying that to have a good space to hear the voices and the presence and the visibility of all learners, then it will be very good we make use of, or what personally I have made use of in my engagement with students under the DSE short courses and then the post-diploma program. So we also discussed this at length. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks both of those report backs. I was going to say, yes, the question of recognition is exactly that, is to play with it in a way, to think about what recognition means in the online space and what recognition means in the classroom. How do we really see who we're working with in terms of our teaching and like I say, teaching and design as well. Is there one more group? Because we have to...
Yes, it is our group. So it was a group with Rolene, Amani, myself, and Tula. So I'm just going to quickly share some of our key pointers. So we only spoke about question 1, and we spoke about the online mode being very challenging because you can't really connect to students, you can't see their bodily gestures and facial expressions. And even when they turn their cameras on, there's only so much. And Rolene said that, she found that some of the students, they could connect, but they did not have like audio, so they couldn't speak. And that was very limiting. But she used WhatsApp as another way to hear their voices and for them to get involved. But then we said, what about classes that are, 1,000 and 500, because she only had 28. And then Tula shared that she uses surveys in a way to, before her class starts, she just wants to connect and to know who's in the class. So she would use surveys to do that, to know more about who she is in the class with and what they want out of it and so forth. And I, of course, said I use a lot of visuals. I like images and photos. And as I go about designing, I put a lot of that in, and I encourage the lecturer to share photos of themselves, to ask the students also to share photos of themselves, because images and names are so powerful, so that's what we discussed for question 1. I don't know if there's anyone in my group who'd like to add, if I missed out anything.
That's great. Thanks so much, Widad. Thanks so much for sharing that. And yes, the idea of images is powerful as well, as opposed to text, because I suppose text is our go-to. So thanks everybody for sharing your, as I say, your knowledge and your experiences. And hopefully we've all learned, picked up a couple of tips in terms of how to work with concepts of visibility, voice and presence, both in the online space as well as face-to-face. We have a few minutes left, but before we get to the video, I just want to share, for me, I suppose I'm wanting to share and think through how I approach social engagement or student engagement as social engagement. And so this idea of image, interesting that we finished that conversation on image. So for me, within this image, who is the teacher and who is the learner? if this is a classroom space, who's the teacher and who's the learner? What does this image tell us about context, being, and power? And what does it tell us about visibility, recognition, voice, and engagement? Right, so if you can just think through that, and this is of course right here at UCT. Having been there, how do we go back? Or how can we go back? Or why have we gone back, right? So assuming historical and conventional pedagogies, which this image, again, the idea of image represents, right? The idea of the lecturer and teacher as all-knowing, disembodied, empty vessel students, student numbers, the idea of power as unidirectional, one way, all of those sort of things. So having been in 2015, 16, and 17, and now possibly still teaching in this kind of way, for me, of course, is a question around colonial and decolonial pedagogies. So we're going to watch a video quickly, and then after the video, we'll quickly just begin to pick up on some of the questions based on that. Max, if you can start the video, please.
The struggles which are taking place today here in South Africa about the need for decolonized education has a long genealogy in African thought. You can go as far back as the 1860s and 1870s when the struggle was for universities to be established in Africa. And the people who were actually championing that, to mention a few, is Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was based in Sierra Leone. Casley Hayford was based in Gold Coast by then, which is today Ghana, and Houghton, who was also in West Africa, and many others. What is very distinctive about that early agitation for education was that, one, they wanted Africa to have universities. But from that very beginning, they were beginning to say, we want specifically a specific type of a university. And Blyden talked, is the first person, I think, to whom we can trace the idea of African university. In the 1860s, he says, we don't want a transplanted university, a university transplanted from Europe into Africa. And he then says, the problem with a transplanted university is that it comes with the race poison. That was one. Two, he was worried that if the university is transplanted from Europe or America into the continent, the second thing which it will carry is actually the textbooks. He was worried that the textbooks which were existing and written by Europeans by then, and even today, they always presented the African as a barbarian, a heathen, a barbarian, worse than a fool, to say the least. And he says, if we take such text and they bring with them with the university, then it will actually destroy the confidence of the African, and it will transform the African into something else. And he was saying, we want an education which actually affirms what he termed by then African personality. And to him, the education which was supposed to be provided by a university was education which was African in content, African in orientation, African in philosophical orientation. In that way, he was saying that type of a university will not actually lead to what we call today alienation, whereby you then distance the person from his or her society, distance the person from his or her language, distance the person from his or her culture. And he says, if that type of a university comes into being, then we are finished. In other words, we become copycats and imitators of other people. And that is not knowledge. That is what in my language I will call an epistemicide. An epistemicide is a process whereby you kill other people's knowledges, cultures. And that is always attached also to the second problem, which is the problem of linguicide, whereby you then kill the language of the people whom you find. So you can go as far back as 1860s and 1870s for that, but they did not succeed in what they wanted. The universities which then came, the early universities, was Fura Bay College in Sierra Leone, and it came as part and parcel of the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. Achimota College near Accra in Ghana was part and parcel of University of London. And it means that they failed in getting an African university. What they got were colleges of metropolitan universities in Africa. At least, those were few who were there. The agitation for more still continued until after 1945. And after 1945, that's when you have many. You have Makerere, Ipadan, but they come as colleges of the University of London. And they coming as colleges from University of London, it means the curriculum actually comes from London. The exams are set according to the standards of London. And the assumption was that a young person who grew up in Manchester, in Liverpool, and a young person who grew up in Soweto, they actually must imbibe the same knowledge. That was the thinking. And there was a debate even among early Africans by then, that some were saying, but if we wanted the technology of the West, we cannot want the technology and do not want the civilization. So in other words, we must take the technology plus the civilization. In other words, destroy our own and accept that. And others, they are saying, no, we want technology, but we don't want the civilization. We have our own civilization. We don't want it to change from being us into something else. And that is the debate which went on until the time of decolonization in the 1960s, with the people like Nkrumah, people like Kenyatta and many others coming on stage to argue that the decolonization process is not only a political process. It's decolonization, but at the same time, the decolonization must come also with the decolonization of knowledge. And it means that we need to decolonize the university, which were already on the continent. The University of Legon in Ghana, which now is the University of Ghana, Ibadan, Dar es Salaam and others. They needed to be decolonized. And what the fundamental question which we are facing from that time up to today, what does it mean to decolonize a university? By then, there were initiatives which were taken. Decolonizing a university means, first of all, they then changed the name from the colonial name into an indigenous name, like University of Gold Coast becomes University of Ghana. Secondly, it meant that you are decolonizing by actually then saying the vice chancellor must actually be black, the professoriate must actually be black, the students who come in must actually be black. But that's a very minimalist way of thinking about decolonization, because that you might have Africanized. You might have Africanized, but have you decolonized? In other words, if you bring a professor who is black like me into the university, don't take it for granted that you have already decolonized because you have brought a black person. The challenge, the key challenge, is that you bring a person like me who is produced by the same westernized university. I can be black in color, but in terms of my epistemology, my thinking, it might actually be Eurocentric.
Thank you, Max. Okay, so I need to share my screen again. Max, are you sharing my screen or?
Okay, there we go. I can see it now.
Can you see it now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so having watched that, I know we don't have a lot of time, but it's about, for me, I thought the question I was asking everybody around, what is sort of the social justice theories and pedagogies that you draw from in your teaching, both design and practice? So for me, decoloniality and decolonization is an important social justice theory and pedagogy that I draw from in my work. And as I was showing the different images, after the moment of 2015, 16, 17, how do we see and hear students? How are we relational in the way we design and teach? We can't pretend that didn't happen. We can't not see, we can't not have heard. And so how do we include that in how we teach and design? What have we learned from the decolonization moment that enables social justice pedagogies in higher education? And how has it taught us to see and hear and enable students to show up in learning spaces? So there's quite a few questions here and we don't have time to respond or to answer, but I'm going to use the last 3 minutes just to open up to any questions, any comments. It can be any part of the presentation, earlier part or now the second part that we didn't really have much time to discuss. But I'm opening up and let's just take some questions or comments.
Benita, if I can go.
Yes, please do.
So thank you so much for your presentation and that powerful video. I had lots of interesting points, and I hope that one day we will have an opportunity to discuss deeply. But he mentioned the African university. What would an African university be like or constitute, like the characteristics?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, so in the other hand, so I want to take maybe 2 or 3 questions. I'm not sure who it was. I just saw 2 or 3 hands going up while I was speaking. Shanaz, there's a question from Shanaz as well.
Hi, Benita. Thank you for that powerful video. And I would just want to know, I appreciate what he said about just because the academic is Black doesn't necessarily mean that their epistemology has changed and that they've decolonized. And so my question is, how do we go through that process as colleagues where we maybe, as Black colleagues, challenge or question or encourage others whom, with their process of decolonization.
Thanks. Thanks, Shanaz and Widad. Yeah, I see Richard said something in the... Yeah, I see Richard. Yeah, I see people are saying very insightful video. Yeah, absolutely. Partly what for me, in terms of an African university, is thinking through sort of the decolonial lens, right? And I don't think there's any one answer to that question we did. I think there's several questions, but that's why for me, it's important to work through decolonial pedagogies and decolonial theory to begin to look at the concept of coloniality. So we cannot talk about decoloniality if we don't unpack coloniality and how it still manifests in higher education in South Africa, and then specifically and particularly to UCT. And so coloniality, again, I mean, I don't want to go into a theory thing, but it's around sort of the structures of the colonial matrix, of knowledge being in power, and looking at how, as I say, how what we talk about, not colonization necessarily, but coloniality as a pattern of long-standing power still operates within our education and within the institution, and it's beginning to shift and change that and transform that, right? So that we can begin to explore what decoloniality can be and what that then means for the creation or co-creation of an African university. And so for me, often decoloniality is about also just an imagining of a future and a future university rather than decolonization only, which is more only about unpacking the impact of colonization. And so decoloniality for me is one of those things to begin and help us, a tool to help us, or a theory to help us think about the African university. And then Shanaz, in terms of your question around colleagues, so it's this kind of thing, in some ways I was wondering, just as I was even playing the video now, I was wondering, I only got to UCT, I started working in 2019. So in many ways, it felt like it was past the decolonization moment, which was the 2015, 16, 17. And as I was playing that video now, I was wondering, oh, isn't this perhaps, hasn't this been played several times at UCT? Haven't people like really interrogated and engaged with this concept of decolonization and decoloniality? So I didn't know the responses or answer to that question, but I had to try anyway, because it's something that I'm interested in terms of a social justice pedagogy that I draw on and explore in the classroom, you know, and the kind of things that both that Sabelo and Lovo Gacheni is talking about. And there's several of these videos, and we play it in, there's a decolonizing citizenship facilitators course that I teach, and we use these videos. And then I've also been starting to use it in other spaces to start a discussion on decoloniality and decolonial pedagogies. So I think it's just finding some resources and trying to find ways to, you know, if you have within your staffing complement, if you have a brown bag series, for example, is there something that you can play at the brown bag? Do you have staff meetings or get-togethers or learning spaces? So for me today is a learning space, you know, so how do I bring this to the learning space? So it's how do we take it to different learning spaces with colleagues and then slowly and begin to unpack what this means. So that would be my response. I don't know if there's any other questions. I know we need to leave, it's 4 o'clock. I see Richard's sharing some insights in the chat. Absolutely, Richard, around finding it hard to having a voice. Absolutely, this is exactly why voice for me is so important. Even more so, I think, than concepts of diversity and inclusion, because in many ways, I think it's overused, those concepts, and students dismiss it. So I'm trying to think for myself, what enables me to be in a space? Is it the ability to speak? Is it the ability to be seen? And how does that mean for my own sense of agency? And then thinking through students' agency, right? So what you're asking about in terms of how hard for students to adapt to having a voice. So how do we as teachers and lecturers and designers of learning spaces enable voices? And particularly, and often those two go together, being heard and being seen. As lecturers and teachers, how do we recognize when something is hard for a student and when they eventually then actually make a comment, or they ask a question, or they put up their hand, or they show their face on the Zoom or something, you know, and how do we recognize that moment and what it means for that student? And we draw on that to continue to affirm that students in those spaces, particularly if they're uncertain and doubtful about whether their voice is going to be heard. Yeah, the empty vessel model, absolutely. Again, I was like, oh, is this still relevant around the empty vessel model? But absolutely, it seems like it is still largely relevant in terms of learning spaces and classrooms. Yeah, and then I see there's another comment around from the video, it will be difficult to have a complete decolonization of our education. Can we have an African language school that will not use English, the product of this? Yes, absolutely, Kofi. Absolutely. Those are, for me, the challenges, right? So when we talk about social justice in this space, we've got to think about languages beyond English. And somebody was giving the example of code switching as a way of bringing in multiple languages into the classroom. So that's a great example of starting that conversation, but it's also affirming students who speak different languages that it's okay to speak a different language in this space, in this classroom. And to affirm that, and therefore also include voice in a language that you perhaps as the designer or teacher cannot hear. And that's okay not to have heard that, because there's so many dynamics of power operating in that space, and you always have somebody else that can interpret and translate. And so your work for me, also the classroom space and the learning space, is a team space where we co-create with students and they teach us as much as we teach them.
Oh, Benita, this feels like we have just started a really deep conversation. And I feel really quite heartsore to actually draw this to a close, because it feels like now we need to be sitting around in comfy chairs with a glass of something to drink, and just having some really deep conversations. So I'm hoping this reading group continues, but I'm hoping that this has deepened our understanding that we can bring to further conversations. So deeply grateful for the insights that you have drawn our attention to today, and yeah, just given us a few pointers and learning from each other as well. I think you've actually modeled the co-creation like really well. So thank you very much. I can see a couple of people have had to leave because we've gone past 4, but I do want to thank you very much. And this is being recorded. So for those who didn't hear all your final comments, we can still get back to those. So thank you, Benita, and thanks everybody for participating and for being visible and having a voice and bringing your presence this afternoon. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, and thanks everybody. Thanks for your participation and your presence, you know, because these kind of sessions can't work if people don't participate. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care. Bye for now. Thanks for Dad.